Hello YouTube, welcome to another episode of the Tarot Topics series. In this series I want to talk a little bit about the minors and specifically how the minor suits apply to different questions or different areas of life. So in the last Tarot Topics I talked about cycles and how I sort of came to understand the cycles of the suits as I was learning about tarot. And another thing that I learned when thinking about minors is thinking about how they actually relate to the question or how they actually relate in a reading. So the first thing I thought or assumed when I learned about the minors, or I guess a way that it made it easier for me to understand them, was to think of them as having to do with different areas of life. So, pentacles applying to work and finance and home, wands applying to projects, creativity, hobbies, swords applying to learning, study, communication, challenges, and then cups applying to social life, relationships, emotions. So I think that's a good place to start, but it's limiting to think of the suits only in that way because for a few reasons. One, if you do a question on one topic and then you get a bunch of cards that correspond to another topic, then how do you read that? Or you might get a mix of suits. Does that mean that your question is about something totally different? So the conclusion I came to, or what I learned from reading more and reading the tarot more, is that is one way to look at suits, but they also are very much about the angles, I think, of a problem, or the angles of a question. So for example, if I do a work question and I get a ton of cups, then I might ask myself, what are the emotional elements of the situation at work? How are my emotions coming up at work? What are my relationships at work? What are my business relationships? How am I communicating at work? With people, etc. Another place where this came up for me was thinking about, I kept getting confused between pentacles and wands, I think, because I thought of wands as the project suit, and describing the journey of a project, but then pentacles would come up and they would relate more or kind of make sense with a project. And I realized that the two are not mutually exclusive. I think wands is about passion. It's about it can be about projects, but it's the sort of desire, the creative drive, the passion. And then I think of pentacles as sort of being the practical element, the work you put into it. And so, for example, if you're thinking about a project, this also relates to the last video when I was talking about the kind of end of each suit. The wands would indicate that the cycle ends with burnout, which is often true when you think about passion. But when you think about the project itself, or you think about the work, it doesn't necessarily end that way. So it might be that you, at the end of a project, you achieve a state of 10 of Pentacles, where you're leaving a legacy, you've done awesome work, but then your passion, your drive to do the thing is reduced, or you need to pass it on, and that would be the end of the wand suit. So those two can kind of work together. A lot of cards from different suits will work together in that way, and I think that's what's really interesting about the tarot, is that you can combine different angles of a situation. So how are you feeling about the thing versus how you're thinking about the thing, what your passion is versus what your effort is. You get some really interesting combinations. And I think also that when you read cards together, sometimes you will notice the shadow side of something or an alternate perspective by the cards you pull versus what you expect to pull. So if you are doing a reading on relationships, for example, and you get a lot of pentacles, maybe you haven't been thinking about the resources that you're putting in, the time and energy that you're putting into a relationship, or the work or effort that the relationship is taking. So maybe that's an angle that you want to use to look at the relationship situation rather than a more straightforward like cups energy. So those are some of the ways that I think that those things can combine, but I'd be super curious to hear your take on the minors and how you combine different energies of the suits in readings. So leave a comment below if you have thoughts, and of course don't forget to like and subscribe.